Greetings, it's Emperor Jabari here. Welcome to the Empire. Before we jump into the topic, I'd like to cover a few changes that have happened throughout the Empire from nothing. First, the obvious one. This immaculate set of armor that I'm wearing, crafted by the finest Edo artisans of the neighboring kingdom of Benin. Secondly, I want to let everyone know that the official From Nothing website, fromnothing.info, has been updated with a more streamlined and user-friendly interface, notably the sources page, which is now organized into a neat table, and a simple Word document, in case you prefer it that way. And while you're there, the Empire from Nothing has a new product available in the market section of the website, where you can make video requests, for a fee. There are many more exciting changes to come, so hang tight, but for now, let's proceed with today's exciting topic. In the American school system, the typical discussion regarding African history, if it's mentioned at all, usually consists of a curriculum centered around the narrative of European exploration and colonization of the African continent, as well as the enslavement and the exploitation of its people, and not really much else. As a result, many of us are left with the false narrative that Africa was a land of nothing more than nomadic tribes of emaciated hunter-gatherers at worst, and scattered agglomerations of hut-laden villages at best, and that they were quickly and easily overwhelmed by superior European technology, and that today, Africa is a dark continent, full of poverty, trapped in time. This false narrative also makes it seem as though this technological steamroll was due in part to a general lack of any expression of interest, curiosity, or intuition regarding European technology, or any local capabilities that were comparable enough to compete with European technology. While guns were adopted at a fairly quick rate in the centuries following European contact, there was one notable European innovation that was seemingly ignored by Africans: their ships. Together with firearms, European ships were arguably the only major technological advantage that they had over their African counterparts regarding military and economic power prior to the 19th century. It is often assumed that Africans were perfectly content in their primitive dugout canoes, with no desire to partake in any shipbuilding or maritime activities, or simply lacking any local boat-building technologies of their own beyond simple designs. However, as always, there's much more nuance to this story than what meets the eye, and in this multi-part series, we'll be taking a deep dive into this fascinating topic. To start things out, there are a few misconceptions about African maritime capabilities that we must clear up before we continue on to the main topic. Maritime prowess was arguably the single most important technological factor that allowed European dominance over global trade and politics, and it directly led to their subsequent rise to power and influence that they held over the past few centuries that continues up to the present day, even more so than firearms. The lack of analogous African maritime technology is often used as a basis to discredit their ingenuity. However, there are a few important things to consider. The first one being that all seafaring traditions of the world originated from regional trade with neighboring peoples, rather than the long-distance voyages of the 15th century onwards. One of the primary reasons for this discrepancy is simple. Africa as a continent lacks any nearby landmasses like what can be found in Europe or Asia. Most of the African landmass consists of one massive continental plate with a few large harbors, peninsulas, or islands that would warrant the use of ocean-going vessels. By contrast, places like Europe, Asia, and even the Americas are absolutely packed with regions like this, and naturally, many seafaring traditions evolved over thousands of years, like the numerous Mediterranean civilizations of Greece, Rome, Carthage, and even the Taino peoples, who regularly engaged in oceanic voyages between South America and the numerous islands and peninsulas of the Caribbean Sea. Southeast Asia had a similar situation, a part of the world packed with numerous peninsulas, wide harbors, and vast chains of large archipelagos, and as a result, Southern and Southeast Asia, as well as the neighboring Polynesian peoples, arguably had the strongest and most well-developed tradition of seafaring in history. In fact, the oldest definitive evidence of permanent human habitation in Madagascar, located off the southeastern coast of Africa, is actually attributed to Southeast Asian people from Borneo, as a result of this strong seafaring tradition ubiquitous to the Austronesian peoples. The African continent simply lacked this type of proximity to other large landmasses or island chains to warrant the time, energy, resources, incentive, or labor required to facilitate a strong seafaring tradition, with the exception of North Africa and the Horn of Africa, which were linked with the aforementioned Mediterranean world. And not surprisingly, both of these regions had strong traditions of maritime trade and warfare, just like their European, Southeast Asian, and Caribbean counterparts. In other words, for most African societies, there was really no good reason to invest the time, money, energy, and resources developing ocean-going boats when they lived nowhere near any other landmasses besides their own, all the while being perfectly capable of operating complex societies linked by long-distance overland trade routes, which they took full advantage of. In fact, it is estimated that during the Middle Ages, roughly 2/3 of all gold flowing into Europe originated in sub-Saharan Africa, and all of it arrived via the Mediterranean coast by way of overland trade routes. It is also worth noting that the navigational skills required to cross the vast Sahara Desert and locate the precise locations of small oases and towns along the route was arguably a more difficult task than navigating a ship across the ocean, and would have been more directly beneficial to the societies of sub-Saharan Africa. Additionally, these overland trade routes would have linked directly with the Mediterranean Sea, which undoubtedly exposed sub-Saharan African civilizations to boat-building cultures and traditions. So the knowledge of maritime technology would have definitely been present in places like West Africa, especially after powerful rulers like Mansa Musa took Hajj to Mecca. He would have certainly encountered ships during these travels. Additionally, the tropics of the Atlantic Ocean are plagued by some of the most dangerous seas in the world, and with currents that are not very conducive to seamless voyages, as the major currents of Africa are as follows. The Canary Current, which flows from the Iberian Peninsula of southern Europe to the Senegambian region of West Africa, before it branches off to the west to become the North Equatorial Current, taking any ships with it across the Atlantic Ocean, ultimately ending up in the Caribbean Sea. This is the very same current that took Columbus's first voyage of 3 ships to the Bahamas in the October of 1492, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. It's also worth noting that there is circumstantial evidence that the navigator of the Santa Maria was of African descent. While much debate exists, some academic circles claim that this navigator by the name of Pedro Alonso Niño, also known as El Negro, was born to a Spanish father and an African mother from what is now Ghana, although I have been unable to confirm these claims from any academic sources, but I digress. I know that ads can get pretty annoying and repetitive, but please hear me out. It's been quite a few years since I've been using Happy Hippo products, and I can confidently say that their traditional medicine has changed my life. They help me remain focused and energized, help with my anxiety, and put me in a generally good mood. I've recommended them to my friends and family with nothing but positive results, and that is why I recommend them to you and anyone else who can benefit from them. In fact, they even have a few types of African traditional medicine as well, like Akuama and Kana. You can get a 10% discount on your entire order site-wide if you use my promo code FN10 at checkout at happyhippo.com. The Canary Current was taken by Christopher Columbus purely on a hunch, as not even the best European sailors with the best ships ever dared to take a ship out into the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean up until this point. Aside from the voyages undertaken by the Vikings like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson centuries earlier, that were unknown to other Europeans at the time, and were more practical due to the close proximity of Scandinavia to Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, rather than vast, open, and empty tropical waters of the mid-Atlantic Ocean. And as far as most people of the world were concerned at the time, the Atlantic Ocean was thought the edge of the world up until 1492. And then finally we have the Benguela Current, which travels from the southern tip of Africa to southern Nigeria, where it combines with the Guinea Current. In other words, it was impossible to travel back after sailing anywhere south of the Sahara or into the sea at the edge of the world and back without paddling directly against the wind with oar power, and this is the very reason that no European dared to sail directly to sub-Saharan Africa until the Portuguese did so early on in the 15th century. This only became possible after the advent of the caravel, which took advantage of the triangular lateen sail, a borrowed technology from the Arabian sailing vessels or dhows. And it was with this borrowed technology that it became possible to sail directly against the wind, a necessary requirement for any return trips from the West African coast. This was accomplished by pivoting the lateen sail into the direction of the wind to generate momentum, and then immediately readjusting the sail into the other direction, tediously riding this momentum directly into the wind and then back against the wind, and repeating. This repetitive action known as tacking was the only way that navigating the disagreeable winds of the West African coast became possible. So, with all these factors in mind, it is also worth noting that West Africans still did have strong traditions of boat building for thousands of years. In fact, one of the oldest boats ever discovered was from West Africa. The Dufuna canoe, which was unearthed in Nigeria in the year 1987, has been tested in numerous reputed university libraries throughout Europe and America. Radiocarbon dating has confirmed that this boat is over 8,500 years old. It is the oldest boat in all of Africa, even predating those found in ancient Egypt. In fact, it is the third oldest boat ever discovered anywhere in the world, the others being the Pesse boat of the Netherlands and the Noyen-sur-Seine boat of France. This is especially notable considering the location of its discovery in the hot and acidic tropical soils of West Africa, which are notoriously terrible for archaeology, as they are not very conducive to the preservation of organic materials, and considering that the Dufuna canoe was composed entirely of organic materials, African mahogany wood to be exact, its endurance throughout the ages is remarkable and was only possible due to the waterlogged and oxygen-free clay deposits that it was unearthed from. It was buried underneath the sediment of an ancient lake that has long since dried up, a process that is also ideal for the creation of fossilized remains. With that being said, it is reasonable to assume that the tradition of boat building in West Africa is much older than the Dufuna canoe itself. But, considering the aforementioned environmental factors, older examples would have likely rotted away thousands of years ago, if not subjected to similar conditions to the Dufuna canoe. This is also apparent when you look at the other two older boats from France and the Netherlands, which are significantly smaller and relatively crude in their appearance, consisting of little more than burnt-out logs, which indicates that boat building traditions in that part of the world were less developed or ancient at the time that they were built. By contrast, the Dufuna canoe shows evidence of being carved and chiseled from both the inside and outside sections of the boat to form a proper stern and bow. Lastly, archaeology is significantly less established in Africa in comparison to Europe, so there could be many other examples just like the Dufuna canoe, just waiting to be discovered. Despite the antiquity of boat building in Africa, most boats of Eurasia gradually developed into more composite vessels, containing several unique and specialized parts, all contributing to boats with complex shapes and sizes. Over the millennia, the complexity increased due to the many factors that influenced the traditions and incentives that we covered earlier. The same is true for the boats of North Africa and East Africa. In addition to the geographical incentive for these civilizations to develop such boats, resources also came into play. Much of Africa is covered in fast-growing rainforests and thus contains abundant supplies of wood. According to a recent report by the EU Joint Research Centre, only 1.5% of Europe's forests consist of old-growth or undisturbed forests. With that being said, carving out a boat from one large tree trunk was a lot less efficient use of wood for the construction of boats in a part of the world with a dwindling supply, as opposed to using small planks to form a multi-part vessel, a much more economically and environmentally viable option, which in turn paved the way to the formation of more unique and complex boat designs. Additionally, the specific type of wood plays a factor, as not all types of trees are compatible with dugout hole designs. But wait, most of West Africa is relatively treeless like Europe, right? The Mali and Songhai empires, for example, were among the largest kingdoms in African history and primarily existed in an arid region known as the Sahel. The Sahel is an ecological zone that exists as the transitional biome between the permanent deserts of North Africa and the permanent grasslands or savanna of sub-Saharan Africa. It is essentially a full-blown desert during the dry season and a grassland during the wet season, with very few woodlands to speak of. The ones that did exist there were more or less deforested in much the same manner as Europe's ancient forests, due to centuries of unsustainable boat building and ironworking industries. Despite this, the aforementioned Mali and Songhai empires derived the bulk of their power and supply chains through sophisticated naval activities along the many rivers of the region, including the Niger, Senegal, and Gambia river systems. So, given the similar circumstances to Europe and a primarily naval infrastructure, why on earth did they continue to use dugouts? Well, they did, and they didn't. Dugouts definitely still existed within these empires and states, and in fact, they were still the dominant form of boat technology in the region. Despite the climate, forests could still be found in relative abundance along the banks of the Niger River during pre-colonial times. However, plank-built boats also existed in West Africa, notably in the Senegambian region. Stay tuned for the next video in this series, where we will explore both dugout and plank-built boat traditions of Africa in the next part of this series, and take a deep dive into these unique and fascinating vessels built and navigated along the West African rivers and seas. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and enable notifications. For sources, go to fromnothing.info/sources. If you'd like to make a video request, you can do so there as well under the market section, or if you simply want to support the Empire from nothing, consider becoming a patron or sending a one-time donation. Links to all of this can be found on my website, which can be accessed from the link provided in the description below. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.